What's up? Welcome to another episode of Bitches Love Sports. I'm Jess Monet, and today we get to talk about the Dallas Cowboys. As always, let me know if you can hear me. You never know when we have technical difficulties on here, but I'm pretty sure I'm good. My earbuds are working today. I can hear myself, so that means y'all should be able to hear me. So, hopping right into what seems to be the topic of the week, the Cowboys culture. So, I released a video. I don't know, my days are running together, so it might have literally been a couple days ago. Was it yesterday? Might have been yesterday. I released a video where I basically did a breakdown of a recent episode of Micah Parsons' podcast that he did while he was on Media Row at the Super Bowl in Vegas, at the Super Bowl festivities, I should say. And he and CD Lamb were having a very honest conversation about a lot of things that have happened since the Cowboys' playoff loss to the Green Bay. They addressed the comments made by CD's mom. CD brought up some questions that he had about his lack of targets in the first half. He talked about his need to, quote unquote, grow up. And they talked about wanting to be leaders. Now, at the time, a lot of people were also thinking about other leaders on the team in terms of coaches and personnel. They were trying to figure out who was going to be on our defensive staff, who was going to be our defensive coordinator, so on and so forth. And since then, Mike Zimmer has been hired as a defensive coordinator of the Dallas Cowboys. And so when I said, yeah, there's some things that I haven't spoken on, that was one of the things. And I'll be honest, when it comes to things like defensive coordinators, if I'm going to talk about it, I want to be able to be thorough. I want to be able to go into detail. And after he did his press conference, I finally felt like I had an angle that I really wanted to talk to my listeners about. And that is, he talked a lot about the culture in his press conference. And when I say a lot, it wasn't outright. It wasn't like he got up there and like, the culture, the Cowboys need to change. But for me, as I was listening to him, I felt like a lot of the things that he did say were related to the current culture of the Cowboys and his perception of it and what he thinks his role will be in terms of shaping the culture in 2024. So I definitely want to talk about that with you guys. I pulled some clips from the press conference. So the press conference itself was a little over 30 minutes long. I cut out some pieces of it that I felt were like less relevant, but we are going to go over that. And then also some video clips from a few other people. So pretty much everybody who is connected to the Cowboys has had something to say lately. We've heard from current players, we've heard from former players, fans, content creators, family members. And so this week, a soundbite from Emmitt Smith also went, I guess you could call it viral. I don't even know anymore. I've barely been on Twitter this week, if I'm being honest. But it was something that I heard about, and judging from the views that it got on YouTube, it seems like quite a few people heard about it. And he had some things to say, so I want to dive into that, and then also revisit some things that we didn't address from what Micah Parsons said before. So, like always, if you're over on Twitter, feel free to join us on YouTube so you can make sure that I see your comments if you want to join in that conversation or if you have questions. Because even though I have clips here, if there's something that I don't address that you want to address, feel free to throw it in the chat and we can talk about it. So yeah, let's hop right into it. I'm gonna pull up the video and it's gonna go in chronological order. But there are some skips, y'all. So let's have fun with this.
Same. All right.
Started with David. Okay. Mike, David Moore, Dallas Morning News. You start by talking about what attracted you to Mike Zimmer and what you expect him to do with this defense from what's in place.
Well, I've always had such great respect for Mike. You know, we've competed against each other so many times over the years. I mean, even going back to New Orleans when Mike was coordinating here in Dallas, and obviously our time in the NFC North. So, really just going through the whole process, post, announcement of Dan getting the Washington job. We kind of had two buckets that we looked at as far as individuals that were tied to the existing defense, and then looking at former head coaches with something that, if you points to my history is a preference that I feel is very important. And then having a chance to sit down and talk to Mike and I'll let him talk about his time off and so forth. But I just think it's an incredible fit for us.
So I'm gonna be honest. Ever since the end of the season, I've had a hard time like truly trusting a lot of the things that Mike McCarthy says. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that throughout the season and during the preseason, he did a lot of talking about creating a certain type of culture among the Dallas Cowboys and getting people on the same page and having people understand their why and so on and so forth. Then the season ends in a very disappointing fashion, and you start hearing these players basically say things that suggest that that culture wasn't actually in place, that they weren't always on the same page, especially if you listen to CeeDee Lamb, and that they didn't always understand their why, and that they weren't always thorough in analyzing everything and working to improve. And so after hearing Mike McCarthy say that all season, and then he comes into a press conference and he's like, yeah, I think Zimmer is a good fit for us. I'm just like, all right, if you say so. Like, how much stock do I actually put in what you have to say at this point? But I will say that if we do take what he says at face value, at this point, he's talking a lot more about his fit with Mike Zimmer. And one of the things that I've noticed among Cowboys fans is that a lot of people, whenever they talk about Zimmer as a fit for a coach, they're talking about someone coming in and bringing in a sense of discipline, accountability. A lot of people have mentioned that they're looking forward to having, legitimate linebackers on the team and things of that nature. And although Mike McCarthy has said that Zimmer is a good fit here, he hasn't really mentioned any of that. He talked about what he likes about Zimmer in terms of who he wants to work with. And that's very different than talking about what he expects Zimmer to actually do for the team. So let's keep going.
Is that the other point, especially now that you're a play caller as well, the comfort you have with Mike having been a head coach before and just turning over that side to him?
Definitely. I mean, I think there's just so many things that go on, even more so today than back in 06 when it's my head coaching career started, that you have to do. And I think if you are going to, there's only so many minutes, so many hours in a day. I know as a head coach, you're responsible for everything, but the reality is you can't be everywhere. And so I think the importance of the leadership role on defense, outside of scheme, calling games, and coaching players, there's so much more that goes on as far as the assistant coaches, and I think it's important. And obviously Mike's experience and success that he's had at every level is, once again, just makes this a great fit.
So once again, he's talking about the responsibilities and whether or not Zimmer can do the job from a sense of taking care of the responsibilities of the job. Now, of course, all those things will play a role in him being an effective defensive coordinator in the sense of him getting results. Obviously, if you can't handle the responsibilities of the role, it is going to be difficult to actually be effective and actually impact the defensive unit in the kind of way that would lead to the kinds of changes a lot of people want to see, right? So I get that, but I guess as we go on, you'll kind of see a theme of, yes, they're saying a lot of good things, but we're not really at a stage yet where I think we can depend on a lot of the things that fans are anticipating seeing with this particular change.
Zim Clarence Hill, Fort Worth Star-Telegram. How does it feel to be back, and did you ever expect to come back?
It feels outstanding. I mean, I got two grandkids, twins that my daughter has. I'm excited to be around a little bit more. I've always loved Dallas. I've always loved the Cowboys. I've had a chance, a lot of times, Mike and I were on a committee together, so we were able to kind of talk away from football. Back in the day, we're on the John Madden committee. And then
So I'm gonna pause it there real quick. So he said that they were on the John Madden committee together. So the John Madden committee is actually a subcommittee of the NFL competition committee. So I'm really just saying this to add a little bit of context to what he's talking about. So it was the coaches subcommittee of the NFL competition committee. And it was led by John Madden. If you were to go to the NFL website and look for the John Madden committee, you wouldn't find it because that wasn't the official name of it. That was the unofficial name of it because John Madden was very instrumental in putting that particular committee together. And it was at a time whenever he was very concerned about player safety. Now, I only did a little bit of reading about the committee. The committee itself, whenever they did meet, they seemed to be very focused on putting plans together in order to get certain rules and bylaws changes in place in order to make the game safer for players. So I'm not sure how much like personal talking they did or how much talking about the game they did, but if you're kind of wondering like, okay, I wonder what their interactions were like on that committee, that's what the committee was. So if you're curious about it, go look up the coaches subcommittee of the NFL competition committee and you can find out a little bit more about what they did. But honestly, the people who are talked about the committee or talked about on the committee more are like Andy Reid, Ron Rivera seemed to be very instrumental in the committee, and there were a few other people, obviously the two of them. But yeah, that's what that was.
And then, did I ever think I'd be back? I don't know. I always kind of hoped I would be. When when my time was off, I'd had some phone calls of going places, and I wanted to be somewhere where I knew people and I trusted people. And so when this opportunity came up, I was excited because the relationship I had with Mike and even the conversations that we've had since I've been here, telling stories about when we played up in Green Bay or they played in Minnesota, and then with Jerry and Steven and those things. But I've had such great respect. I actually told him the same thing. When I was in NFC North, he was the one I respected the most. They were the best team. They were the most well coached. Their teams played the right way. And so we tried to emulate a lot of those things, and so that we could hopefully compete against them.
So they would never thought of.
So the time they were both in the NFC North was 2014 to 2018. That would have been the time that they were both in the NFC North. And of course, 2018 was the year that Mike McCarthy ended up being fired. So I'm guessing it was before that. Well, actually, it might not have been before that because interestingly enough, when Mike McCarthy was fired from Green Bay, Mike Zimmer was one of the coaches who came out and said he thought it was a mistake for Green Bay to fire Mike McCarthy. I didn't really find a long quote from that, but that is something that I remember reading, that he did say it was a mistake. So even though 2018 was the year that Mike McCarthy ultimately ended up fired, it does sound like Mike Zimmer respected who he was as a coach up until the moment that he left Green Bay. So I would say that's legitimate. And it's interesting because there were kind of rumors, a little bit of speculation that one of the things that was taking so long with the hiring of Mike Zimmer was the idea that with Mike McCarthy being a lame duck coach, that there was a little bit of concern on Mike McCarthy's part that having someone who had a relationship with the Joneses on the staff could end up being an issue. I don't know if he felt that Mike Zimmer himself would purposefully sabotage him, or if McCarthy started to feel like maybe during the season, if things became an issue, that they would just get rid of him and let Zimmer become the interim. I'm not really sure, but that is something that a few different people talked about. But it does sound like when Mike Zimmer says that he respected Mike McCarthy as a coach, based on everything that I've read, that sounds legit.
Retirement, anything like that after Minnesota?
No, not really. Sometimes it's forced retirement, but it's more about getting the right situation for you. Like I said before, I had other opportunities that I could have taken, but I wasn't going to go somewhere that I didn't feel comfortable with the organization and the people there.
Mike, Todd Archer with ESPN. What do you think of the pieces that you have available to you here on this defense, and how can you make this defense better than what it's been?
Yeah, well, hopefully I can.
So I'm gonna be honest. As soon as he said, "Hopefully I can," I started to get a little bit concerned. I think I would have liked to hear a little bit more confidence from him with that answer. Now, I will say, for anybody who hasn't seen this press conference, the answer to the question immediately after this made me feel a lot better about everything he said with this particular answer. So I really just pause it because if you're like me and you hear him say like, "Hopefully I can," it's like, wait, what you mean, hopefully?
We're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. I mean, they've been pretty good. I know there's been some situations where things haven't happened, but that happens in coaching. It happens a lot. So we're going to look at the players, try and figure out the best way to use them, put the scheme together. And again, we want to take the good things that they've done and maybe add a few more other things that we've done good in the past and try to make this thing manageable where, we're disciplined and we're, well coached. We're play together as a team. We try to make sure everybody understands their role so that other people on the field can have success doing their job.
Okay, so he talks about being disciplined, well coached, and making sure everybody understands their role. Now, from everything I've heard about Mike Zimmer, that actually sounds like something that he's really good at. So I'm glad that he mentioned that. I'm glad that he mentioned not reinventing the wheel. I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel. The Cowboys are an organization that more so needs new wheels. So don't reinvent it. Just replace the ones that they have, like, new tires. Kind of like how sometimes people get like different tires for the winter. Like the Cowboys need different tires for like an effective defense throughout the entire season, including postseason. But from what I've heard, when it comes to him making sure everybody in the defensive unit is on the same page, they know each other's roles, that actually does sound like something that he's kind of known for, very good at. So, I mean, of course he mentioned it. I'm glad that he mentioned it. But I was listening to, what's the name of the podcast? I listened to a few minutes of Locked On Cowboys right before I came on live. And they kind of talked about that for a minute on their show. Let's see. Cowboys Huddle says, I think we'll do well for our defense. He's very competitive and hard on fundamentals. He actually does mention that later. I think it's actually in the next answer for this next question.
John Machota with The Athletic. Specifically, though, with Micah Parsons, what have you thought of him as a player? And does he kind of remind you of any other players you've worked with?
Yeah, I mean, obviously he's a terrific player. You watch him on tape and he makes some unbelievably athletic plays. At this point and stage right now, I'm trying to figure out, get the coaches in here, and then we can sit down. And I think one of the strengths that I've always had is to look at players and kind of have a vision for each player and then try to figure out how we can use them in the best way. One of the things I would hate to do right now is to tell you how I'm thinking about playing him without talking to him and letting him think, okay, this is what we're thinking about doing with you, Micah. I don't think I should tell you guys first before I tell him, if that's...
So I respect the hell out of that answer for a few reasons. Hold on, let me play for it. So, yeah, so it's not like a white screen sitting there. So one, the usage of Micah Parsons has been kind of a controversial topic among Cowboys fans and content creators for like half the season. So for him to come in and not feel pressured to answer that question, I respect that, because there's no way he didn't know that that was a hot topic of discussion among the fan base and among the kinds of people who would be watching this press conference, right? And so not only does he say, hey, I'm not going to answer that right now. One, he mentions respect for the player. He says he wants to talk to Micah before he talks to the media about what that anticipated role is. So I think that shows a respect for the team and a respect for Micah, because honestly, that's how it should be. Not saying that I'm mad at the media for asking, like that's their job. And if he did have an answer and he did somehow make time to talk to Micah, good for him. But he didn't, and he's sticking to his guns on the order in which he likes to do things. And another reason that I respect this answer is because although he doesn't answer that part of the question, he does kind of let us know where he is in the process. That's why in the thumbnail for this video and in the title, I do mention the process of Zimmer, because he says that word a few times. A lot of people watched this press conference, and what they walked away from it with was, just the ideas that he brought up about discipline and accountability. But what I heard over and over again was him talking about the process of getting ready and where they are in that process right now. And it kind of gave me an idea about what we can anticipate over the coming weeks and the coming months. I can talk, y'all, I promise. But yeah, so he said that he's trying to get staff in here. And he also mentions that he likes to look at players and figure out where they're going to go. And that kind of goes along with what he was saying earlier about making sure every player understands their roles and also making sure the players know each other's roles. each other's roles. It also goes along with what some people have been saying about how he doesn't have like one particular thing that he does, and he tries to make players fit into that. How he's very adaptive, how he can go into a situation and he can figure out what's going to work best in that situation. He can change over the course of the season. He can change from one season to another. And I think that's something that Cowboys fans will really appreciate. After the end of the season, whenever people were talking about their criticism of Dan Quinn, and you start wondering how people went from really loving Dan Quinn to having some issues with Dan Quinn over the course of just a couple of seasons, a lot of it had to do with his failure to adapt. When Dan Quinn first came to the Cowboys, a lot of the things that he was doing in terms of player flex, they were innovative, they were really interesting, they kind of saved the day in some ways. You know, we saw him put people in different positions that people were like, he doesn't play that, and it worked, you know? But then after a couple of seasons, you know, and especially this past year, with so many teams running the ball on us, attacking what should have been linebackers, people were kind of like, okay, why weren't there adjustments here? Why didn't we anticipate that this would happen? This happened earlier in the season. How come by the time we got to postseason, we didn't have an answer? We didn't have a solution, right? And so it's not like people all of a sudden hated Dan Quinn. It was like, based on how he came in, I think a lot of people expected him to be smart enough and innovative enough to keep innovating and to keep coming up with answers and to keep coming up with solutions, and he didn't. But Zimmer, on the other hand, seems like someone who is in a position to do that. Well, not in a position, but someone who's got the experience and the knowledge necessary to do that. So I'm really excited about that.
Calvin Watkins, Dallas Morning News. Coach McCarthy was away. He went in the lab and looked at a lot of different things. Did you do anything similar to what he did when he was away?
Well, I did some of that. You know, a lot of it I did a lot of reflection on what my time in Minnesota, you know, the 8 years, the things that I felt like we did good, the things that I felt like I didn't do as good, trying to figure out, you know, how I can be a better coach in the future. Obviously, there was always some tape watching and things like that. Marvin Lewis and I was a great friend. You know, we did a podcast, and then afterwards we'd sit on there and we'd watch tape together and talk about players and talk about schemes and things like that. But a lot of it was reflection on you know, what I did well and what I didn't do well.
Okay, so the podcast he's referring to with Marvin Lewis, he and Marvin Lewis both work for 33rd Team right now. So if you go to 33rd Team and look up either one of them as authors, you can find some of the stuff that they did together. And they're not really long episodes. We're talking about like, you know, 9 or 10 minute episodes where they would, you know, talk about stuff. And, you know, apparently, according to Zimmer, afterwards they would watch film and talk about players and whatnot. So yeah, that is a thing that happened. I think the most recent episode was like in October or something though. But before he mentioned that, which, you know, a lot of people latched on to that part when it came to, oh, you know, he's still paying attention to the game because he did this podcast. Okay, that's great. But here's what I really liked about that answer. I like the fact that he said he did a lot of reflection. Now, at first, I was concerned about that answer because I'm like, reflection. Like, I need you to be current. I need you to understand what's happening in the game right now. I don't need you thinking about the past. But he said he was doing a reflection about what happened in Minnesota and how he could be a better coach. And the reason why I like that is because if he's still doing podcasts, he's still watching film. Obviously, he's current in terms of, you know, what the trends are in terms of offensive and defensive schemes, what's working, what's not working, you know, where things might be headed, so on and so forth. But when it comes to what he said about wanting to make sure players are on the same page about what he expects from them and about what everybody's role is, that means that you've got to be able to reach people. That means you've got to be able to connect with people. That means you've got to know not only what you're coaching, but how you're going to coach it. So the fact that he took time to think about what he did in Minnesota and say, okay, how can I be a better coach? I respect that tremendously. And like I always say, I say this about a lot of people, the fact that he was willing to say that out loud says a lot. Because when you're willing to say something like that out loud, you're basically putting it on record to where people can hold you accountable. Like, hey, you said you had done some reflecting on how you could be a good coach. And now, you know, you come in here, you're doing X, Y, Z. It doesn't really seem like you did the right kind of reflecting what's going on. So, you know, it's not like he kept it to himself. Like, he's coming out and telling Cowboys Nation, a lot of people who are being introduced to him for the first time and saying, hey, there are some things that I could do better. I've been thinking about that. I plan to improve. So I dig it. Got a couple of comments in here. I'm going to check a couple before we move on to the next section of the video. Unity says, LOL, the build a linebacker thing by having safeties in the box hurt us come playoff time. I 100% agree. I'm interested to see if they address that room in free agency next month, in addition to the draft. A lot of people are interested in the answer to that. And I don't think we'll know for a while. And by the time we get to the end of this, you'll know why I feel that way.
Saudis, The Athletic. Mike, when you kind of look at the way I know you haven't been out that long, but when you look at just the way offenses evolve constantly in the NFL, whether it's the McVays and Shanahans and all that stuff, where have you kind of seen the NFL offenses go, and how do you kind of see your defense fitting?
Yeah, there's a lot of different kind of scheme things that you're starting to see a lot more of the receiver outside motion and with speed going up the field. You're seeing, obviously in the last few years there's been a lot of the jet sweeps and rocket motions and things like that. So I think that's been a lot of it. We've all talked about the different ways to handle it, and football is an evolving game, whether it's offense or defense, and so it all kind of comes back. The defense catches up, then the offense catches up, and it just kind of goes from there. So without being too specific, I know I'm not, but we'll have ways to combat these things.
Just curious about your thoughts on Al Harris and kind of, as you're putting the staff together, how he kind of fits in.
Yeah, I had a good visit with Al and the rest of the coaches here, and he's, it's up to. Obviously, Mike has made the decision that these guys are going to be here, and so we had a good conversation that that he's going to still be here with us, and I'm excited to work with him. And I've heard a lot of great things about the work that he does, and really all the guys here.
Okay, so I'm going to address those last two answers together. So about the Al Harris thing, just real quick, what was interesting to me about that was when it was first announced that Al Harris would be saying, I think a lot of people assumed that was because Mike Zimmer wanted him. And Zimmer basically here is saying like, okay, that was actually a decision made by Mike. So now I'm a little bit curious about how many of those decisions are going to be up to Mike. Because we've already heard in the very beginning, Mike talking about the importance of him looking for certain qualities in Zimmer. Like when they asked about why he was excited about Zimmer being here, he talked about a lot of the things that related to the two of them working together and not necessarily what he anticipated Zimmer doing for the team. And if you listen to the answer just before this last one, it kind of makes sense. It sounds like Zimmer's trying to still figure out exactly what he's going to do. I was having a conversation with someone about this hire, and they were like, do you think he's going to run a 4-3 or 3-4? And then somebody else who was also in the same conversation was like, yeah, I heard he's really big on press man. And I'm just like, I'm just thinking about all this. And I'm like, we still need to get a staff in here. And so it was kind of interesting that he kind of mentioned that as well himself. So that's one of the reasons why I think it's going to be a while before we hear anything legitimate about what they plan on doing in terms of how they plan on going about finding linebackers and whatever other position, because honestly, they're just not there yet. He's taking his time in a way that he's being thorough, not in a way that I necessarily think that they're going to let things slip through the cracks or procrastinate. But it sounds like they're trying to be thorough and make sure that they do things in the right order. But when it comes to who's going to be on his staff, the way that he kind of deferred to Mike kind of makes me think that maybe he doesn't have as much reign over that as a lot of people have been anticipating when they talk about the impact that he's going to have on this defense.
It was announced that I was going to be here. I've heard from so many players that played for me, players here, not just defensive backs, but linebackers and defensive linemen texted me and said how happy they are for me. And I think if I was such a jerk, I wouldn't be hearing from those guys.
And secondly, you were part.
So, can y'all hear me? I can't hear myself now. Okay, I think I'm back. All right. If you're in the chat, give me like a thumbs up or something. Let me know that you can hear and see me. Like, I know I disappeared for a second. But anyway, in that last answer, he was addressing the fact that apparently he heard that there's, I guess you could call it rumors, that he's somewhat of a jerk. Now, what's interesting to me is that he, in this moment, says, I'm not a jerk. If I was, these people wouldn't be like reaching out to me and saying that they're happy for me. But as we listen, I think it might just be the word jerk that he has an issue with, because he goes on to talk about how, he's tough on players and how certain things make him quote unquote grouchy. So yeah, just keep listening for that. I'm just pointing it out now so that you do listen for it. But that's what I think it is. I don't think it means that he plans on being soft or he's trying to be like a player's coach. I think it's just certain words and certain descriptions that he's not particularly a fan of.
I thought that was 2 questions.
So he says that and then immediately does something jerk-like.
Most of you want one more quick one. You were part of Brad Sham, Cowboys Radio, Zim. Let's go back to even when you first went to Minnesota. The young men coming into the league as players, how are they different, the kids who come into the league now compared to back then?
I think, Brad, the biggest thing is the ones that want to be great, they want to be coached. They want to be coached. Now, there's a lot more social media. There's a lot more of the outside stuff going on. But, the ones that I've been around, the young guys, the ones that want to be great, they want to be coached. They want to study. They want to understand, how they can get better. And to me, that's what all the great players, they want to know, how can you make me better? And, so I think, and y'all had Anthony Barr here. I love Anthony Barr. He was a little hurt when he, playing here, but, he was a young guy and he was terrific, great leader, studied, did all the things. And, so we had a lot of guys like that come in there. Now, I coached the Polynesian Bowl high school all-star game a couple weeks ago, and now those guys were dancing between plays, and they had the attention span of about 2 seconds. But I think great players want to be great.
So I'm gonna pause right there and talk about what he just said about players wanting to be coached. Real quick. Hey, Vachi. Thanks for tuning in. Appreciate you. But yeah, as far as players wanting to be coached, that kind of connects to what I was saying a second ago about how he was saying, okay, I'm not a jerk, but because whenever he starts talking about players wanting to be coached, he's like, people who want to be coached, people who want to be great, they want to be coached, they want someone who's going to make them better, right? So what that says to me is like further reinforcement for the idea that he's not going to be a player's coach. And I kind of had to laugh a little bit whenever he brought up Anthony Barr, just because I don't know a lot about the Cowboys fans' relationship to Anthony Barr, because that was like a little bit before the time I started covering the Cowboys. But I had a few people who were like, I just hope he doesn't bring back Anthony Barr. And I don't know what the situation is, but apparently that man traumatized a few people for the one season that he was here. But yeah, when it comes to the idea that good players want to be coached, I think that's significant based on what we've heard from some of the star players of the Cowboys recently, and specifically Micah Parsons, which we're going to talk about that a little bit more in detail later. But if you listen to the episode of Micah's podcast that he did with CD, he talks about wanting to be in a position of leadership, wanting to take that role more seriously, and wanting to impact the culture of the Cowboys, right? Now, I had someone ask me, they said, okay, he's been on the team for multiple seasons. Why hasn't he done it yet? If that's really what he wants to do, why hasn't he done it yet? And why should we believe him now? Why should we believe things are going to be different? And so I brought up 2 things in relationship to that. One, I said, and I say this about young players all the time, especially when I'm covering college players that I like, sometimes you just don't know something until you know. In other words, let's take, for example, what Micah Parsons was saying about how there were certain things they needed to work on throughout the season, and they kind of kept brushing it off because they were winning, When I heard Micah say that, it sounded like from his perspective, he, like a lot of other people, thought that they would get better over time, that week by week, practice after practice, they would get better. And so they didn't really need to trip over it per se. And then you get to the end of the season, you get to the postseason, and some of these things bit them in the ass, right? And so it sounds like that experience kind of woke him up to the idea of like, you know what? We don't need to do that next time. Next season, when we start seeing these things, because he makes a comment about if somebody's off sides at practice or at training camp, we just need to run on them, right? So it sounds like that's something that he just had to experience in order to understand, like, hey, despite what all my teammates are saying, we can't just let these things slide, right? The other thing I brought up was the fact that I said, all throughout his athletic career, going from college till now, Micah Parsons has been praised for having the best performance, for being the best in terms of work ethic, for being so flexible in terms of positions that he can play, and for having such an impact on the field. I said I wouldn't be surprised if there were very few people who actually told him what he needed to improve or told him how he should get better. I would guess that he received a lot of praise. So I really like the idea of someone coming in here, and despite how impactful he is, despite his work ethic, despite the leadership role that he's taking on now that he's been with the Cowboys for a while, I would really love for someone to come in and say, despite all that, my goal is to make you better. And that is something that Zimmer has talked about throughout this entire press conference, is that he wants to help make players better, and that he believes good players want to be better and they want to be coached. So that to me says he's not going to be afraid to coach anybody, including Micah Parsons.
Hey, Mike, Pat Doney with NBC here in Dallas. You were talking about the players you coached clearly not thinking you're a jerk in your style, but it was Darren Winston who was at the Super Bowl, your biggest cheerleader, talking about how hard you coached, but the impact you made on him. Those players from those teams, I mean, what's the relationship like? We heard you mention Dion and what he did for you the last couple of years too. How much do you appreciate the relationship with those Cowboys great players that you're now part of this organization again?
No, it's everything. I think that's part of the reason why you coach, is to try to develop players and then develop a relationship with them, and then hopefully someday they appreciate what you've helped them do. The coaches can't play for them, obviously, but maybe you can help them get a little bit better. Charlie Williams called me the other day, which Charlie, he had a nickname that I can't say here, but a lot of these guys, that when you hear from these guys and they call you from, and I've had several Minnesota players call me as well. I think that's, it makes you feel good because, they think about you and they appreciate you.
And then he said that your style is to not be someone who is your friend, is to get the best out of you. How would you describe your coaching style? Has it evolved at all over the years, or are you still the same guy you've been your entire career?
Well, I think these guys that have been here saw me 18 years ago. They've evolved. Otherwise, they wouldn't be sitting there. And I think I've evolved too, or otherwise I wouldn't be sitting here. But I'm demanding. I try to get the best out of the players. But to me, there's a difference. I had one player who was a terrific player, and you could not yell at him. You had to put your arm around him. You had to talk to him, whisper. He didn't like to be reprimanded in front of people. And so that's what I did with him, and he became a terrific player. Other players, I'd get after, and, probably know some of the names. One of them was here. But I'll say it to him, Pac-Man Jones, right? He gives me the biggest hugs now when I see him. But we've had our issues, going back and forth, and I think everybody's different. You try to hit the button, however it is to make them better.
So that answer to me connected to two things that he said previously in this press conference. First, he talks about how he took different approaches with different players, right? And that to me connected to what he said about having to examine what he did well and what he didn't do well while he was in Minnesota. And it sounds like his ability to cater his style to different players is something that he feels like he did well, is something that he feels like was effective. And speaking of being effective, he goes ahead and clarifies here that, he's not trying to be players' friends. He's trying to help them be better. He's trying to make sure that they're coached well, right? And so, like I was saying earlier, when he said, in so many words, he said he took issue with being called a jerk. And some people were wondering, okay, does that mean he's going to come in and try to be nice and try to be nice to people? And I don't think that's what he's saying. I think he just doesn't like the word jerk. But if you listen to what he said, he had issues with certain players. Okay, so that to me sounds like conflict. That sounds like some disagreements. That sounds like maybe there was some tension, right? And so when those players were interacting with him and they were saying things that maybe they didn't respond as well to, they might have called him a jerk, right? So it sounds like he doesn't necessarily like that word, but he uses other words that definitely suggest like, oh yeah, I'm going to be kind of tough on some of these people, if they need it. But one thing that I do appreciate is that it sounds like he's going to be tough on people when it's needed. So some of these people who don't respond well the first time he says something, people who need constant reminders, they might see a little bit more of his jerk side than others. So I honestly think it's going to be up to the players whether or not Mike Zimmer turns out to be a jerk or not. I'm going to read a few of y'all's comments. Hey, Eastside Herald, how are you doing? Voch Lombardi slander is not allowed in my chat, Eastside. So I'm going to need you to not be thumbs downing at Voch. Thank you. Let's see. Ryder says, the issue with the defense this past season with Dallas is they peaked in the first half and then hit valleys in the second half. Hard to argue with that. That's DeMarcus Lawrence saying the defense was tired recently. Oh, God. I could not believe he said that. Oh, man. I'm not going to get into that. I'm going to end up talking about it for like way too long, and we still have more video to go through. So I'm going to let that one go. I'm seeing people say we need solid linebackers. Agreed. Deion Sanders loves Mike Zimmer. 100% agree. Clement, hey, how are you? Says too many front runners on defense, not enough physical guys in the trenches. You know what? I think that's accurate, but I think a lot of that has to do with some of the things that happened in terms of players being played out of position, not only because of what their tendencies are, but because of their size. So, like, we did have a few people who are very physical. Like, you got to, of course, show love to Micah. You got to think about people like D-Law. You got to think about people like Hankins, right? But I think, at least when I hear people talk about our defensive players not being very physical, they talk about the hesitation that they saw in the linebackers. And I think there were a couple of reasons for that. One reason that a lot of people don't talk about is that LVE's value to the defense was very much as the green dot guy. And it takes a very special set of skills to be the green dot guy. You have to be smart. You have to be aware. You have to communicate with everybody about their roles as well as know your role and know it well enough to be aggressive. So you have to be aware of everybody's roles, but not so wrapped up in their roles that you don't get stagnant yourself. And I think that was an issue that LVE had sometimes. But once he went down, it's like, who really did that well? Like, I know we don't hear a lot about what happens in that role, but I think the reason it ended up with who it ended up with, which I think it was with Jaron Kearse, for example, for at least a little while. But before it ended up landing with LVE for an extended period, it was passed around. At one point, Micah was the green dot. And the reason why it was taken from him was they said that he had a really hard time doing the green dot role and actually executing his role very well. So I think that's one thing that's going to make a difference. I think that's something that hopefully they'll look for, because I think if everybody has a little bit more certainty and a little bit better communication with what they're supposed to be doing, we'll see it be a little bit easier for them to be aggressive. But then there's also the fact that if your linebackers are actually converted safeties, and so one, they are, I'll just say it, they're smaller than linebackers should be, right? And then their tendency is to backpedal more often than they run towards contact. I think that's where you see a lot of that hesitation as well. So I think that issue with not enough physicality is multifaceted. But I do think we've heard Zimmer say different things throughout this press conference that suggest he can address each of those facets. So it'll be all right, is what I'm saying. Unity says, my soccer coach was hard on us, but we would have ran through a wall for her. And you know what? I'm really glad that you said that, because I think that's something that people don't think about. We think about a coach being hard on the players and we're like, oh, they're not going to like that. They're going to rebel. And the fact is, for any of us who have played a team sport competitively, we kind of know what Mike Zimmer's talking about when he says good players want to be coached. We know what that feels like. We know what it means to have someone be hard on you, but you get better from it. And it kind of brings people together. And then whenever you see the results, I won't say it makes you like mind it a little bit less, but it's like at the end of the day, who was it? Was it Bill Parcells? I think you said winning isn't fun. The process of winning isn't fun. You have fun after you win. That's kind of the idea, right? We don't really care if the players enjoy practice. We want them to have an effective practice. So that's the thing. She was tough, but she had our respect. It'll be the same way with Zim and our guys. Totally agree. All right, let's move forward a little bit. I might skip forward a little bit because I have other videos to get to, and we're only halfway through this one because y'all are leaving such great comments. Thank you.
Got it.
Kevin Sherrington, Dallas Morning News. You talked about how you evolved, obviously, as everybody else had. What has not changed about you since you were here last time?
Competitiveness. Probably being technique oriented, being fundamental, disciplined. Those are the kind of things that kind of get me grouchy.
Okay, I think I disappeared. I might still be gone. Give me 1 second. So my camera is actually an iPhone. And one of those Amber Alert things came up just now, which is something that has never happened. And it ruined my picture, I think. Hold on, I might be back. Can y'all hear me? Can y'all see me? I'm getting quick at handling these technical difficulties, y'all. So did y'all hear that last answer that he just gave about the things that make him grouchy? I'm gonna go back a few seconds.
I think everybody's different. You try to hit the button however it is to make them better.
Got it.
Kevin Sherrington, Dallas Morning News. You talked about how you evolved, obviously, as everybody else had. What has not changed about you since you were here last time?
Competitiveness. Probably being technique oriented, being fundamental, disciplined. Those are the kind of things that kind of get me grouchy.
I love how he smiles after that. Why does this man have no lips? But yeah, so him saying those are the things that make him grouchy. That's probably the third time, I think, in this press conference that he makes reference to him at times having a, let's call it, less than pleasant demeanor, right? And so that's why earlier in the video when I was like, I think he just doesn't like the word jerk, but he does acknowledge that there are things that make him quote unquote grouchy. He does acknowledge that sometimes he's hard on players. So we're kind of hearing that he's admitting to, yes, sometimes I'm not pleasant. Sometimes I'm hard on people. Sometimes there might be conflict. There might be disagreements. There might be tension. But it sounds like as long as you don't call him a jerk, you can call him grouchy. You can say he's hard on people. Just don't call him a jerk and he's fine. But everything he's saying is confirming what people are thinking about him being hard on players and, just having a very stern idea of what it takes to meet his expectations. And I think that might be the last significant things. I really do want to get to some of the other videos that I had. So I'm going through my notes to see if there's anything else I really wanted to talk to you guys about. Okay, I think it's right after this. So we'll look at this for a few more minutes and then we'll move on to the Emmitt Smith stuff.
Ed Warder, ESPN. If each of you could address when Dan Quinn was the defensive coordinator, obviously created a great emphasis on turnovers and defensive touchdowns, and you guys dominated that statistic across all 3 years. Does that approach continue here, or do you have to give up something there to be more sound and play, defense against the run and so forth, areas which have been weakness in recent years?
I mean, I don't think so. I think every coach is trying to win the turnover battle. I know that's been, my personal history as an assistant and as a head coach. So how you train it, I think it's like everything in this game. Mike's talked a lot about technique and fundamentals, and your ROI usually speaks to the energy and what you put into it. But with that, it's also, we're aware of the discipline things that we need to be better at. But I don't think that takes away from our ability to take care of the football and take the ball away.
How big a point of emphasis is that for you?
Well, it's always a point of emphasis, and I do think, if you look at turnovers, typically they come from quarterback hits, overthrows, things like that, where quarterbacks make the wrong reads. You knock the ball out of somebody's hands because you're physical. I think all those things kind of incorporate all those things, and if you have, in my opinion, I've always felt like you have to be fundamentally sound to get to the football in the right way, and then once you get there, then now it's doing that, and then if you never hit the quarterback, you're not going to get turnovers. So obviously we're always going to try and hit the quarterback.
So I really like the fact that he emphasized physicality in that answer, because essentially the question was like, hey, we've been really big on turnovers. Is that still going to be a thing, or are you focusing on something else? And he's like, yeah, we'll still get turnovers. We'll force turnovers by hitting people. I love it. So yeah, for whoever in the chat was like, yeah, we need more physicality. And I feel like we all kind of feel that way. Like, okay, it sounds like it's coming. And I'm gonna go ahead and let this last answer run, because what I think is his next answer anyway, I think connects to something I want to mention regarding this. Eastside Harold, are you still in the chat? You've been quiet ever since I told you we don't tolerate Voch Lombardi slander. You upset?
I got one for each, Mike. Zim, I'll start with you. You mentioned how some of these players have reached out to you. Were there some of those players who maybe had to mature a little bit before they understood what you did for them when they were players? And if so, what did they say they figured out or understood?
Yeah. So I'll give you a good example. Xavier Rhodes called me probably 5 months ago, and I was on his rear end every day about being disciplined, getting in the right footwork, all this stuff. He became a terrific player, and he called me and he just said, Coach, I know how hard you were on me, but I appreciate what you've done for me and the family and the things like that. And I mean, you hear that, there's I probably was too hard on a lot of players, but I've heard it several times, and so I think that's it makes you feel good that they understand that you're just trying to help them. You're not just out to be a mean guy or something like that. So.
And then Mike, for you, Jerry talked about being all in. Can you give us your description of what being all in would mean for this organization?
For the organization? Yeah. I'm just trying to get coaching staff hired right now. No, I think with that, obviously we've had some really good teams in the last couple of years. We're disappointed that we haven't reached the ultimate goal, but yeah, I think it's just identifying the fact that it's important to go back and start with the basics, and that starts with player acquisition, and ability to get the new staff and get the personnel guys in the same room next week, and just make sure we just stay on point and do the things we need to do to make sure that we're winning, and building that confidence and the things you need to do when it comes down to the stretch, in the playoffs, and win and and win playoff games and win championships. So, but as far as everything else, that's the way I took it.
Mike McCarthy, Dallas Morning News, for Zimmer. What needs to be done in the months ahead to get this run defense to where you want it?
I think this is the answer I'm looking for.
Guide that.
Well, we got to get the staff together first, and then we got to go through the film. We got I hate saying process all the time, but there's a process about getting first off, we got to get all the coaches on the same page. We got to speak the same language so the players can speak the same language. So when they come off the field, they speak the same language to me, and because they say, oh, this guy did this or that guy did that, and I don't understand what they're saying. So we got to get the communication down first, the techniques down second. We got to make sure that we figure out where the personnel is and put them in the right place, and then get them coached up and let them go. It's too early. I've been here a day and a half now, so it's too early to know a lot of the things that we have to do. But that's kind of the routine that we're going to go through here.
Okay, so that's the answer that I've been looking for, because I think ultimately that is probably the most important thing that he said in this entire press conference. And the reason why is because, let's be real, the fan base, lots of people, they're looking for answers. I think the fan base, a lot of it is still in a very negative place, somewhat in disarray. And people are wondering, how are we going to take care of the linebackers? Is the defense going to be more physical? Like, things that we literally won't be able to truly answer for months, regardless of what anybody says right now. Pretty much anything that they say right now in terms of results is a hope. It's a goal. It's not something that they're actively working on. Based on the CBA, they literally cannot actively work on it right now. So he starts talking about the process, and he says that he hates using the word process, but I actually love that he used the word process for that reason. So when he first started the answer, he said, we've got to get the staff together first, and we've got to watch film, and then he kind of stops himself and he's like, well, we got to get the staff together. We got to work on communication. We got to work on techniques. We got to get personnel in the right place, and we got to get them coached up. So both he and Mike McCarthy said that they're trying to get the staff together right now. Mike McCarthy said that he doesn't have a timeline. There's a point later in this press conference where Mike Zimmer gets a phone call during the conference, and he's like, oh, is somebody looking for a job? Hopefully Wilkes. But he says somebody looking for a job. So, there are people out there still looking. I know everybody's kind of like, oh, it's so late in the process. Like, who's left? They'll figure it out. Okay. And at this point, there's nothing that any of us can do about who's left or who's not left or who's already off the table or what the Joneses budget is or whatever. But the fact of the matter is, while a lot of us are looking for, I guess you could say, assurance that things are going to be different next year, this is where they are. So we've got the combine in 2 weeks. And I think a couple of weeks after that is the official start of the NFL 2024 year. So it's like a month before they can even really start doing anything significant with free agents. And I just don't anticipate them, especially this particular offseason, giving us a lot of clues in terms of what they're actually going to do. So as for right now, the main thing that fans and content creators should be looking for, I think, is who's going to end up on this staff, because that's where they are. And that's what it sounds like they're taking care of before anything else. So we kind of know what they want. Zimmer says that he wants a defense that's physical. He wants discipline. He wants accountability. He wants players who want to be coached. So hopefully, now earlier, as we acknowledged, he kind of suggested that, Mike McCarthy has a heavy hand in who he ends up hiring on his staff. But hopefully they're on the same page about that. And those are the kinds of people who they'll hire, people who will support that type of goal and that type of culture. But ultimately, that's what we're looking at right now in terms of the changes that are going to be made to the team. They're looking at staff, and then they've got some things to put in place before they start looking at players. And honestly, they've got a little bit of time to put it in place. So for those of you who want to have discussions that actually relate to what's happening with the team and not so much how you feel about the team, that's where the conversation is right now. That's where the actions are taking place. So speaking of culture, I want to talk a little bit about some of the other people who have been commenting on the Cowboys, because outside of who's being hired on the coaching staff, I think the conversation about the culture of the Cowboys is the most significant and interesting conversation happening right now. And I think the reason why it's interesting is because somehow so many people ended up on the same page that the culture is the issue, right? We all saw the Green Bay game. We all saw how it ended. We all saw that it felt like the team kind of quit, gave up in a sense very early on, right? But there hasn't been a lot of talk about the X's and O's. Like, they've talked about it a little bit, but it's almost like the X's and O's were so horrendous. Everybody was like, no, this goes beyond being outplayed. This goes beyond scheme. This goes beyond personnel. This is a problem in terms of mindset. This is a problem in terms of culture. So we've heard players talk about culture. We've heard former players talk about culture. We've heard coaches talk about culture. Fans and content creators have talked about culture. And so Emmitt Smith recently said something, and there are some things that I agree with, and there are some things that I don't necessarily agree with. So I definitely want to hear y'all's thoughts, especially if this is your first time hearing these particular sound bites. I'm going to read some of y'all's comments first, though. Clement says, the need to be more physical in practice, both offense and defense, in preparation for teams like San Francisco, Detroit, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland next season. I agree. And honestly, that's one of the reasons why I'm really interested in whether or not they'll reach out to the guy who's leaving San Francisco, because I'm just wondering if there's something in terms of scheduling or how practices are managed that could be done different. Because I know there are a lot of rules now in terms of when they can do padded practices, how often they can have padded practices, and then Mike McCarthy being so concerned about player safety, I think he tries to limit a lot of aggressive contact as much as possible anyway. But clearly, these other teams are finding a way to practice physicality and to instill that as part of a culture, in spite of the rules of the CBA or the NFL. So I would be very interested to learn about other teams' approaches to that. And what else? That's a logical point. Unanimity of communication on defense, scheming, and protocol. A fractured coaching staff is detrimental to defense. A fractured coaching staff is detrimental to everybody. But yeah, especially for a defense, because of how often the defense has to be reactive, especially when facing a good offense. You know what I'm saying? So if they can get to the point where they don't have to talk as much and where they don't have to be told what to do so much, kind of like what we heard the offense was doing this year, I do think that'll be beneficial to everybody on the defense. All right, so let's pull up these Emmitt Smith sound bites and let's talk a little bit about what he says. Like I said, there are some things that I agree with, some things that I don't. So let's get into it.
And one of the greatest running backs of all time, the all-time NFL leading rusher, and he usually brings tequila.
Oh, he's bringing the
He's
tequila.
got the tequila with him today. The great Emmitt Smith. Emmitt, welcome back, buddy.
Thank you, guys. How you doing?
We're doing great, man.
Yeah, excellent.
Always good to have you here. I mean, we try to make you a yearly thing. Like,
hold on, this might be the wrong version of the video. Give me a second. I did an abridged version of the video, like I always do, and I think I might have accidentally pulled up the long one. Nope, not that one. This one.
McCarthy's still the head coach. How surprised were you that Jerry decided to keep him after that playoff loss to the Packers?
I was completely surprised. I know how disappointed I was as a player to see that product put on the football field.
Yeah.
It is not becoming of the Dallas Cowboys mystique, respect, the brand.
Right.
It is not it's not the appropriate representation of the brand itself. Now, Jerry understands these kind of words.
Yeah.
The brand.
Right.
The star.
Right.
Everything has to be pristine.
Right.
But this was not.
Yep.
That right there was so disappointing, and not only to me, but to many of our fans, and including people that was sitting like, what is that?
Yeah.
It did not look good and wasn't a good look.
He's not wrong. So for anybody who saw the episode that I did where I broke down Mike McCarthy's postseason press conference, that was one of the things that I talked about. I talked about some of the reactions during the game from people like Jimmy Johnson. Emmitt Smith had a reaction that I think ended up going viral on social media. There were a few other former Cowboys players who said something. And one of the things that I mentioned was that a lot of those former players and former coaches still feel very connected to the brand of the Dallas Cowboys. And I also said that I think one of the reasons that they're so upset by the performance, just one of the reasons, there are a lot of reasons to be upset about that performance, but one of the reasons is the fact that current Cowboys players are literally benefiting from what they did, right? So the reason why Cowboys players now have such a nice practice facility, they have the new stadium that they play in, they get more media coverage and better endorsements and everybody, they're known across the world, is literally because of what, Emmitt Smith and the teams that he played for, they did. Current Cowboys players are benefiting from that. And I think a lot of the former players just kind of have this mindset of like, okay, if you're going to benefit from all the things that we did and how hard we worked and what we put ourselves through physically, mentally, emotionally, you could at least make more of an effort, a better effort to try to let that legacy live on and continue to perform in the ways that we did. So on one hand, you've probably heard me say that I don't like the expectation that current Cowboys players are expected to, live up to the expectations that were in place for former Cowboys players. However, on that particular point, I do kind of see where they're coming from. I can see that there's room for argument.
But at this point, I don't know.
Yeah, right.
I really don't know. Outside of going and stealing Dan Campbell.
Yeah.
From the Detroit Lions, because I think his message is the right message
Right.
that a lot of people are missing.
Right.
And a lot of kids are missing.
What message specifically?
I mean, think about what he's doing and what he's saying, how he's saying it. Now, he's making some mistakes too, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
When they go for it and all that kind
Yeah,
of stuff.
right,
Going
gotcha.
for it when you're, come on, coach.
Yeah.
You
Go up
for-
17 in the NFC Championship game.
Exactly.
Right.
He's making some mistakes.
Right, but it's other stuff.
It's other stuff
Right.
that it's the other things that I can deal with some things because I know the message is the right message.
Yeah.
He's going to learn from what he just went through.
Right.
It's not that often that he's been a head coach. So he's going to learn from what he went through.
Yeah.
That part I can almost guarantee you because that's the kind of mentality he had.
But the mentality is just this what we see all the time: grit. Just go out there,
Grit.
fight hard, dig deep, come
Yeah.
together. Just all the
Nobody
stuff
wants
that
to fight
seems
hard no
cliche,
more.
but it
Yeah.
works.
No one wants
If
to
you
fight
do it,
hard
it
anymore.
works.
So, and I'm gonna let him finish because he starts getting into some of the issues that he has with current players. But this is where I first started having issues with what he was saying. I agree that toughness and grit are important, but then he says, well, Dan Campbell has some issues too in terms of like when to call it and yada, yada, yada. And so his focus on the toughness and grit and the way he kind of brushed off the technical details of Dan Campbell as a coach is kind of the issue that I'm having right now with some of the former players. A lot of the responses to the team right now are very emotional, and it's very little offering of actual solutions that would help the team. Now, I don't know who they're talking to behind the scenes, but I think that's what I would like to hear more. Like, we know the team needs to be tougher. We know there needs to be more discipline, more accountability, more grit, more physicality, all of that. But like, could one of you actually offer something tangible that they could, do differently? I mean, I personally would appreciate that. I don't know how y'all feel about it, but I would appreciate that. But what's also interesting about this is, I went to the Star in Frisco. I did a tour. If you ever have a chance to do a tour, definitely do it. It's so informative and pretty cool. But one of the things that they have on display at the Star is a copy of Emmitt's scouting profile, handwritten from back in the day. And one of the things that is mentioned on this scouting profile, you can read it. It's right there on the page. They talk about him being very emotional. They talk about him being very emotional as a player. And just looking at how he's responded since this loss, I think you can kind of see how he's just like very emotional as a person. And I skipped over this part, but there's a part in this conversation where they're talking about something ridiculous that Jerry Jones said, a comment about a glory hole. Some of y'all probably heard it. And he says, "That's my owner." And I'm like, that is no longer your owner, sir. But that's how connected he still feels to this franchise and this brand. He's like still referring to Jerry Jones as his owner, even though he definitely is not. And if he is, then we have some things to discuss. But to my knowledge, and to everyone's knowledge, as far as I know, he's not his owner anymore. But he just feels so connected, feels so strongly. And all of that just seems to fall very much in line with this idea of Emmitt just being this emotional dude.
They want to, we are the
Tell
Cowboys.
me how good I
Tell me how
I
good
hear
I
you.
am.
Right.
Check out my Instagram post.
Right.
See me on my podcast. I'm doing all this stuff. I'm everything.
Right.
Without doing anything.
Right. Yeah.
So, and everybody's patting them on the back without doing anything.
Right.
People want to give them so much without doing nothing.
Right.
And what they're living off of is what happened in the past.
Right.
Not what's going down right now. They're not establishing their own legacy, let alone building off of the legacy that was established. When I got to the Cowboys, I knew one thing.
Yeah.
I knew I could not disappoint Tony Dorsett as a running back. And I knew I could not disappoint Robert Newhouse as a running back, or Calvin Hill, or let alone Bullet Bob Hayes.
Right.
Then I knew I could not disappoint Captain Comeback, Roger Staubach,
right,
Ed Too Tall Jones.
So this was another part where I started to get a little bit frustrated with what Emmitt was saying. And it's just because, once again, it's like, if you feel like they're not doing anything, because like I have too much respect for these players to say they're not doing anything. I'm very disappointed in how the season ended, but I'm not going to pretend like they didn't do anything. They just fell very short of expectations. But if you really feel like that's the case, like, what should they be doing differently? And I honestly want you to name something besides simply paying reverence to people who came before them. Because one, I don't think that's going to help them in this situation. And two, yes, they are living off the legacy of former Cowboys, but a lot of the things the Cowboys did also changed the entire culture and the way the NFL works as a whole. So, for example, one of the things that gets brought up a lot of times when people talk about the difference between the Cowboys then and the Cowboys now is the institution of the salary cap. There was no salary cap until 1994. So teams were put together in a completely different way. So players now are literally having to go into the NFL with a completely different relationship to money, with a completely different relationship to their contract and how it affects other aspects of the team than what they really had to deal with most of the time, right? And then also when it comes to Instagram and the podcast, all those things are not only other sources of income, but they're things that these players can depend on after they leave the game, right? So Emmitt, Michael Irvin, Troy Aikman, all of those people, they had a pretty easy time getting into broadcasting, right? But a lot of the current players, they're going to have a lot more competition when it comes to broadcasting because so many players are already doing broadcasting or already doing media or content in some sense of the word. So it's like, I know it can get a little frustrating when it starts to feel like, oh, these young kids, all they care about is their podcast and their Instagram, right? But I really would like to see Emmitt and others, one, take the time to understand what is the role of these things in these players' entire career and actually build from that base of understanding to actually help them figure out how they can, in this day and time, when the rules around practicing are different, the rules around training camp are different, the rules around the salary cap are different, their relationship to the media is different, their relationship to the fans are different. If you can at least take the time to understand that instead of being so grouchy about it, maybe you can build a foundation there to actually talk to these players and figure out how to help them take that same aggressive, hard-nosed approach you took in spite of all these differences within the sport.
I embrace the history of who we were.
Yeah.
Because I loved them as a Cowboy when I was a kid myself. So when I got there, it's like, shoot, we ain't going to be 1 to 15.
Right.
My mind was already on that. And I knew Michael mind was on it.
Yeah.
Jimmy mind had to be on it.
Yeah, so that's what I say, too. Like, the coach has got to be a part of that, right? Not putting up with nonsense. Is that where you're going?
BS.
I never would have dreamed that the Cowboys would go 28, now 29 years without playing in an NFC championship. I can't believe that.
I wouldn't have dreamed it neither. And like I told somebody earlier, I'm tired of being sold on what the Cowboys could be. I'm tired. I had enough of it.
Yeah.
Because I'm more about what the Cowboys really are and who we really are and who we were. That's where I'm at.
Right.
And that's where everyone else is at. You was this. How do you allow this to happen?
Yeah.
And so for me, it's like, hey, I know the prism which I look at the team through and the eyes, I go all the way back to Starback. I go all the way back to those days.
Right.
There he is going back again.
I go all the way back to those days. And then I come up to where we were at, and I'm like, okay, we honored them. We respected them.
Right.
We respected the history of the game. We love the game. I respect the history of the game like no other, whether it's Jim Brown, Walter Payton.
I think he's just going to have to accept the fact that these players might have a different relationship to the game. And there's a couple of different things you can do once you have that realization. I can talk, y'all, I promise. And this is for Emmitt and any other former Cowboys star that might have these same feelings. Like I was saying earlier, if you really want to impact this team, take the time to understand where they are. It's like, okay, we get it. That's where you were. You respected the game. You respected those former players. Cool. Maybe that's not where they are. So maybe if you really do want to have a positive impact on the current players, you've got to meet them where they are and figure out how to influence them based on where they are now. So if that's your goal, that's what you need to do. However, if this is more about your ego and saying, well, we did this and we did that, and all of these things were so much better than these guys now, then by all means, keep doing what you're doing, keep saying what you're saying. Because while I do agree with you on a lot of things, a lot of this is starting to sound like a lot of ego-infused commentary in the sense that they're not necessarily wrong. There is a need for discipline. There is a need for a different approach. There is a need for a change in the culture. But like, what's the point in continuously comparing these guys to who you were then when y'all are in completely different situations, you know? So yeah, that's that. But what's funny is when I think about everybody's focus on discipline, and this is kind of like a side note. I'm, going off on a little tangent. Have y'all ever seen that episode of South Park where all the kids are learning karate, and then Cartman starts doing like a bunch of extra stuff, and he thinks he's so great because he's like doing all this extra stuff, and he thinks that makes him better. And the instructor is like, "You lack discipline." Like, doesn't even address it like you were being extra. He's just like, your extraness is coming from the fact that you lack discipline. And it kind of reminded me of what Micah Parsons was saying about shenanigans when he was like, yeah, we need to cut out the shenanigans. Hold on, I'm gonna find this clip of South Park. Give me a second. And yes, I do keep random South Park clips on my computer because I have ADHD and I love South Park and they're funny. Here we go.
It's Bangsa! It's Bangsa! Yeah!
Kantaminasan, what are you doing?
I'm doing some sweet Bangsa moves. I'm a little better than everyone else here.
Eric-san, you must follow direction. You lack discipline.
Nuh-uh, don't lack a discipline.
Minasan, you all need more discipline. True discipline come from within.
So I feel like that's what everybody is saying to the Cowboys right now. Like, everybody is looking at the Cowboys like, you lack discipline. Okay, I'm gonna stop being silly. But there is one more thing in that same vein of the lack of discipline. There was something that Micah Parsons mentioned in his conversation with Stephen A. Smith that gave me a lot of hope for how he might approach his role as a leader in this coming season.
When you look across that locker room and you see 52 other dudes, you sure you seeing everybody that think like you? That everybody that wear it like you wear it? Everybody that want it like you want it? I bet you don't.
But that's the difference between good and great, right?
Right.
So that's what I'm saying. Right now, I'm a loser because I didn't do a good job of getting the 52 right.
When you...
So this is one of those rare times that I gotta acknowledge the fact that Stephen A. Smith made a good point. Because he's like, you have this mindset, you have this approach to this game, but can you honestly say that everybody on that roster has that same approach? And honestly, they probably don't. But what I liked about what Micah said, I don't like him calling himself a loser. I don't agree with that. But like, hey, whatever it takes to motivate yourself, do what you need to do. But what he does say is, I didn't do a good job of motivating the other 52. And the reason why I like that is because that's something that my mindset coach used to say all the time, because, a lot of my mindset coach's clients, because we would do group calls together, a lot of us were people who were either entrepreneurs and, worked with other people and or we played team sports, It was interesting to see that intersection of competitive people, how so many of us were both entrepreneurs and athletes. But anyway, one day he finally addressed a question so many people have been asking, because a lot of us are like, what do you do when your teammates just won't step up? When you're busting your ass to be better, but it just feels like your teammates aren't stepping up. And he said, a lot of y'all are leaders on your team. If you don't have a title, then because of your performance, because of your role on your team, you are a leader in a sense. So if you're a leader, why are they not following your example? And his point was basically that we can't control other people, but, we should be able to, if we're doing our job as a leader, we should be able to influence other people and build a culture that gets everybody on the same page in terms of how they should be working, what their work ethic should be, how they should approach practice, how they should approach what their individual roles are, so on and so forth. And so do I ever expect the entire roster 100% to be on the same page? No. But I definitely respect Micah Parsons' ability to take a look at what is happening and say to himself, you know what, I could influence more people. I could do more to ensure that more of us are on the same page. I could do more to impact the culture, to make it the type of culture that will get us different results next year. So the fact that he's even looking at that says that there should be some sort of improvement, because I feel like that acknowledgement is improvement in Micah Parsons' mindset already before they've even started having OTAs, training camp, anything. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what some of the up and coming leaders like him and CeeDee Lamb are going to do, what the culture is going to be like. It's really hard to tell at this stage what it's going to be. You know, everybody's saying the team needs more discipline, more accountability, but nobody really seems to know yet how they're going to instill that and what it's going to look like. They're still looking for staff, haven't even started talking about what players are going to be on the roster. So it's going to be an interesting offseason, especially with a lot of players being a little bit more vocal than we expected, with there being a lot more coaching staff changes than I think a lot of people expected. And personally, as far as being all in, because the topic of them being all in came up earlier. In my opinion, the only way to be all in is if they hire a general manager. That's my opinion. Because I feel like anything else is just the Joneses saying, we're going to try harder. But like, let's be real, what a lot of people feel they need, you know, before you get to who's going to be your linebacker, who's going to be your running backs, blah, blah, blah. A lot of people are actually wanting to see people come in who are better at making those decisions. I mean, let's think about it. That's why a lot of people are so excited about Mike Zimmer. Like, yes, they're excited about, you know, discipline and physicality and all that. But there have been so many people who are like, does this mean we're going to get real linebackers? Like, people really want someone to come in and make better roster decisions, you know? And so it kind of makes me think of clients that I've had in the past where they come to me. I'm a personal trainer, by the way. They come to me and they might say something like, I want to be stronger. And I'm like, okay, to get stronger, you got to lift heavy. And what they think is lifting heavy during their first week with me is very different than what they think is lifting heavy after 2 months, what they think is lifting heavy after 6 months. A lot of times we'll get to month 6, sometimes maybe even as early as month 3, and they'll be lifting things that they never even thought it would be possible for them to lift. But that's because, going back to what I said, sometimes you don't know until you know. Sometimes it takes you trying to realize, you know what, that wasn't enough, and actually I could do more. And then you do it again, and you're like, you know what, that wasn't enough, but I could actually do more. And I feel like the Joneses have been doing what they're doing long enough to realize that they could do more, and more in the sense of getting an actual football mind in that role to make those decisions and actually put a team together that's going to accomplish what they've been promising to accomplish for several years now. So until then, the things that we hear from Micah Parsons and CeeDee Lamb are some of the best things that we can hope for in terms of changes in the locker room. But one thing that I will say, on an unrelated note to Micah Parsons, and this is for anybody who saw this episode that he did with Stephen A. Smith, it basically became a debate between him and Stephen A. Smith about the efficacy and usefulness of Dak Prescott as a quarterback and as an athlete. And the episode essentially ended with Stephen A. Smith trying to make a point and Micah saying, save it, because I guess someone was in his ear saying that their time was up and that they were going to have to revisit the conversation. And Stephen A. Smith seems very excited about revisiting this conversation and having a long period of time to do this. So I'm going to say this to you, Micah. Where that conversation was going, the fact that you ran out of time kind of saved you. I really respect the fact that you're trying to stand up for Dak and you're trying to stand up for your quarterback and you're trying to make what could be some very valid points about what he has to offer as a quarterback. However, Stephen A. Smith has been discussing sports since before you were born. Stephen A. Smith criticizes Dak Prescott probably 5 times more often than you ever have to even think about defending Dak Prescott. So for your sake, please have somebody coach you before you try to go and debate Stephen A. Smith about Dak Prescott. The Cowboys content creator community is full of people who have been called Dak apologists, Dak lovers, Daktivists, whatever word you can think of. And we are all prepared to help you study the dark arts of defending Dak Prescott against criticism. So by all means, please don't feel like you have to do this on your own. I love you to death, but Stephen A. Smith will eat you alive. So if you actually are going to revisit this conversation and debate Stephen A. Smith about Dak Prescott, reach out to somebody. I think I heard Will Still has connections to your family. Talk to him. Smart man, knows what he's doing. He can get you right. So on that note, hey, what's up? How's it going? Yes, I agree. It's going to be a long off season. If any of y'all have not checked out CFO Sports already, you definitely should. Great content, especially if you're a fan and you love having more fan-centric conversations. Really great stuff. I like to say that a lot of our Cowboys content creators are really good at educating fans in various ways. And there are some who do it in terms of the X's and O's, some who do it in terms of the draft, some who do it in terms of just what's going on behind the scenes. And I would say this guy is somebody who does all three in one way or another. So check him out. So yeah, that's everything that I have on the culture. Thanks to everybody who came in the chat. Also, Richard, I can't find your comment, but earlier you said, I need you to go live more. I'm glad you mentioned that because I definitely intend to starting next week. So like I always say, turn your notifications on. I think I figured out a consistent time that I can do it. If you've been watching, my schedule's been crazy for a while and it's been so hard for me to get consistent with the time. But I think I'm finally in a place where I'm like, okay, this can be the time. It'll probably be in the afternoons, but definitely turn those notifications on so that you know when it happens. And yes, I do plan on going live more. So thank you for mentioning that. But yeah, that's all I got for you guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thanks for the comments. Thanks for the likes. If you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share. Some of the stuff we didn't get to in the Mike Zimmer press conference, we'll probably discuss later. So definitely tune in. There's a lot to discuss in terms of the Cowboys, and we've got a very long offseason to do it. So on that note, thank you all once again. I'm Jazz Monet. This has been another episode of Bitches Love Sports, and I'm out.